suspend the rules, and pass H.R. 3542 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3542, a bill to impose sanctions against Hamas for gross violations of internationally recognized human rights by reason of the use of civilians as human shields and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, and the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend and to include extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
I also ask unanimous consent to place in the record an exchange of letters between the Foreign Affairs and Judiciary Committees.
Without objection.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I am grateful for the co-author of this legislation and a good friend, Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts, a valued Iraq veteran, as well as the original co-sponsors, Congresswoman Chairman Eliana Ross-Lehtinen and Congressman Ted Deutsch. I also appreciate Chairman Ed Royce and the House Foreign Affairs Committee for allowing it to proceed to a floor vote. H.R. 3542, the Hamas Human Shields Prevention Act, will sanction Hamas for violating human rights standards by using civilians as human shields. For far too long, Hamas has taken shelter and launched offenses against Israel from civilian areas, including schools, hospitals, and mosques. Their cowardly actions knowingly and carelessly put innocent lives at risk and a gross violation of human rights and international law. Last June, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, discovered Hamas tunnels under 2 of its schools in Gaza, demonstrating how they knowingly integrate terrorist operations with children in civilian areas. Sadly, the Iranians and Hamas are willing to fight to the last Palestinian man, woman, and child in their quest to annihilate the people of Israel. Yet neither Hamas nor Iran have been properly held accountable by responsible nations for their crimes against humanity. Unfortunately, the prior U.S. administration never raised this as a serious issue with the Iranians. The cowardly Iranians and Hamas sacrificed innocent Palestinians for their self-destructive ideology. The world must face the threat of Hamas as it continues to perpetrate atrocities against civilians by using them as human shields. This legislation imposes direct sanctions against any Hamas terrorist who is responsible for using human shields. This Hamas Human Shields Prevention Act encourages the U.S. permanent representatives to the United Nations to secure a UN Security Council multilateral resolution imposing sanctions against Hamas for the use of human shields. It should also sanction federal governments and individuals who provide material and financial support to Hamas, which would cut off the resources that allow Hamas to terrorize civilians. I appreciate that Ambassador Nikki Haley has been outspoken against the murderous terrorists in the global war on terrorism. I believe this legislation will promote working to ensure that lives of innocent civilians of the citizens of Gaza are spared by proactively imposing strong sanctions against Hamas and their murderous actions. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I rise in support of this measure and yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Recognized.
I rise in support of H.R. 3542, the Hamas Human Shields Prevention Act. This is an act that came before our committee and was adopted by voice vote unanimously. I was there. My hearing has been tested recently, and there was not one dissenting voice. I want to thank the Representative Wilson and Moulton for their leadership in authoring the Hamas Human Shields Prevention Act, and I'm proud to be a co-sponsor. This legislation calls out the cowardly use of human shields by Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and sanctions anyone who supports or takes part in this horrific practice. Let us be perfectly clear about what's at stake. There are designated terrorist entities using innocent civilians, even innocent children, as a means to camouflage their arsenals. And every time Hamas does this, every time it's done by Islamic Jihad, the leadership is making a horrific statement. They put a higher value on their efforts to kill Israeli civilians than they do on the lives of Gaza civilians. Keep in mind, this practice is a violation of the Geneva Conventions on the rules and laws of war. It is a war crime and should indeed be sanctioned by the United Nations. First and foremost, this is an issue of basic human rights. Hamas has forced civilians to gather on the roofs of their homes so they can hide terrorist leaders, terrorist military leaders, and hide weapons below. Hamas has even built their tunnels that they use to move weapons and fighters right under civilian infrastructure. This puts hospitals, schools, mosques, markets, and innocent Palestinians at great risk. And it doesn't stop there. Hamas purposely puts rockets in UN facilities, compelling UN to launch daily inspections of each of their facilities during times of heightened tension, and putting international personnel in harm's way. Hamas's use of human shields also raises important national security concerns for Israel, because unlike these Palestinian terrorist groups that seek to kill as many Israeli civilians as possible, in contrast with that, the Israeli Defense Forces are not blind and cannot be blind to the plight of innocent civilians. That's why the Israeli government has tried to warn Palestinian civilians of upcoming strikes, including evacuation notices, text messages and calls, and even low explosive warning knocks. These warnings don't just give innocent civilians the opportunity to evacuate. They also put the terrorists on notice that strikes are imminent, giving them an opportunity to escape. The Israeli government has made an explicit decision. They care enough about warning and saving the lives of Palestinian civilians that they are willing to give an advantage to terrorist groups that are trying to kill as many Israeli civilians as they possibly can. The contrast, therefore, is astounding. While Israel has made bold investments in early warning apps on Israeli phones and developed the Iron Dome along with the United States to protect Israeli civilians from incoming missiles, Hamas makes no effort to protect Gaza civilians and engages in activities designed to cause Gaza civilians to be killed. Hamas puts innocent civilians in the line of fire. They hide their weapon and their leadership beneath schools and hospitals. And then when Gazan children die, when innocent men and women are blown apart, Hamas leadership cheers quietly for what they perceive as a propaganda coup against the Israeli Defense Forces. That is why I support sanctions against Hamas and any of its supporting organizations, any of its supporting individuals that facilitate the use of human shields. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
California reserves. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
I yield 4 minutes or such time as she may consume to the gentlelady from Florida, Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who chairs the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa.
The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank Mr. Wilson for presenting this bill before us today, and I rise in strong support of Mr. Wilson's bill. It's the Hamas Human Shields Prevention Act, and I was proud to join Mr. Wilson and others as an original co-sponsor. 3 years ago, the House and the Senate both unanimously passed a concurrent resolution that I authored, which denounced the use of human shields by Hamas and indeed any other terror group. Using human shields is an unconscionable practice. It is a gross violation of international laws and norms. Yet invariably, the use of human shields ends up being a winning strategy for Hamas. Why? because the international community falls for its deadly ploy. This is despite the fact that Israel is unmatched in its efforts to avoid civilian casualties. We know Hamas forces Palestinians into becoming human shields, and the terror group is known for firing on Israeli targets from heavily populated areas or from places like schools or mosques. They do this on purpose. The disgusting practice underscores the fact that Hamas doesn't care at all about the well-being of the Palestinian people. And the sole purpose of Hamas is to try to force Israel into a situation in which it may harm civilians, hoping to turn then public sentiment against the Jewish state. Mr. Wilson's bill, therefore, puts down an important marker, Mr. Speaker. It builds upon our previous efforts by adding punitive measures, identifying and then sanctioning anyone affiliated with Hamas who does use human shields. Responsible nations must not allow Hamas to continue to use this cynical ploy. And we in the United States, we have a responsibility to lead and to ensure that this gruesome tactic is ended once and for all. So I thank Mr. Wilson from South Carolina for this initiative, and I urge my colleagues to join us in supporting this important and much-needed measure before us today. Thank you, Mr. Wilson, for once again highlighting what a cynical and deadly and disgusting ploy being used by Hamas. And I yield back, Mr. Wilson.
The gentleman from Florida yields back. The gentleman from South Carolina reserves.
I reserve.
And the gentleman from California is recognized.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman from California reserves.
I yield 4 minutes or such time as may consume to the gentleman from New Jersey, Congressman Chris Smith, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
I want to thank my good friend for yielding. And I rise in strong support of H.R. 3542, the Hamas Human Shields Prevention Act, introduced, sponsored, authored by my good friend and colleague Joe Wilson, and we're all very grateful that he has brought this important legislation to the floor. H.R. 3542 is a critical and common-sense measure that addresses Hamas's cynical and well-documented practice of endangering civilian lives for the sake of its terror campaign against the State of Israel. Many independent observers attest to the Palestinian terrorist group's strategy of locating military equipment and installations amidst civilian infrastructure. A 2015 Amnesty International report, Mr. Speaker, entitled Unlawful and Deadly, exposed this reprehensible conduct by the Palestinian terrorist groups during Israel's 2014 Operation Protective Edge in the Gaza Strip. The report documented examples of, quote, attacks launched from the vicinity of civilian buildings or from residential areas, in addition to the use of civilian buildings and facilities for other military purposes, such as storing munitions, close quote. In one instance chronicled in this report, a foreign journalist captured footage of a rocket launcher, quote, located some 50 meters from a hotel frequented by international correspondents, 100 meters away from a UN building, and very near several civilian homes. The footage additionally showed children playing next to the rocket launchers. Amnesty further documented the discovery of, quote, Palestinian munitions in 3 vacant UNRWA schools in the Gaza Strip during the conflict. One of these schools, although vacant, had 2 UNRWA schools on either side of it that were hosting about 1,500 displaced civilians. Mr. Speaker, Hamas's perverse practice of UN installations to shield military infrastructure has not abated since the 2014 Gaza war. UNRWA discovers military infrastructure in the immediate environs of its schools on an alarmingly regular basis. Last year alone, the agency reported discovering 2 militant tunnels located under its schools in the Gaza Strip. Of course, human rights reports and UNRWA statements account only for a limited scope of violations that are observed and documented by international organizations, media correspondents, and credible NGOs. The real scope of Hamas's Human Shields policy is almost certainly far greater. Israeli authorities, for example, reported that out of 3,600 Palestinian rockets launched in the first month and a half of Operation Protective Edge, 1,600 of those rockets, nearly 45%, were fired from civilian areas. H.R. 3542 rightfully calls on the administration to use its voice and vote in the United Nations Security Council to impose multilateral sanctions on Hamas for this disgraceful pattern of exploiting innocent civilians, including women and children, so that it can rain indiscriminate rockets on innocent Israelis with greater impunity. The bill would also impose U.S. visa bans and asset freezes on individuals and entities that direct or facilitate Hamas's use of human shields. By supporting this measure, Mr. Speaker, this House can advance the cause of civilian protection for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Again, I want to thank Mr. Wilson for this excellent bill, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey yields back. The gentleman from South Carolina reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I have no other speakers on this side, so I'll make a few remarks in closing. Mr. Speaker, I want to put this legislation in the broader context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A Palestinian state will never be born as a result of the use of human shields. No country can make peace with a group that uses its own women and children in that manner. And no country can build peace with a nation or an entity that makes the violation of the Geneva Conventions and the international rules of law established military policy. I'm a firm believer in a two-state solution that results in a secure Jewish state of Israel and a peaceful Palestinian state by its side. I hope that this legislation will help move toward that end because it seeks to empower those who want to make peace and sanctions those who cheapen human life and violate international law. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, which passed in our committee without a dissenting voice. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California yields back. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
And first, I'd like to thank Congressman Sherman for his leadership in this bipartisan legislation, which will make a difference on behalf of the people of Gaza and on behalf of the people of Israel. The terrorists of Hamas hide behind school children, hospital patients, and other vulnerable civilians. This cowardly use of human shields is a grave human rights abuse that must be stopped, which sacrifices the lives of innocent Palestinians. I again want to thank the bipartisan sponsors of the Hamas Human Shields Prevention Act, which deserves our unanimous support, and in particular point out the co-sponsorship by Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from South Carolina yields back.